Lula Barnett had spent most of her adult life learning how to recognize the moment a man decided she was too much woman for him. So when Gaston Luciano, the devastatingly handsome mafia boss who had spent weeks finding increasingly ridiculous reasons to visit her flower shop, finally tried to kiss her, Lula panicked. She stepped back. Gaston stopped immediately. His eyes searched hers. Lula wished he'd simply misunderstand. Instead, he waited. And somehow that made telling the truth worse. "Look at you," she whispered. "Then look at me." Gaston did. Slowly. Thoroughly. His gaze returned to her face. "I am." Lula's heart betrayed her with one violent beat. She forced out the words anyway. "I'm too big for you." Silence. Something almost offended crossed Gaston's face. Then he walked toward her. One step. Lula retreated. Another. Her back met the wall. Gaston stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, but he didn't touch her. He planted one hand against the wall beside her head. Lula could still walk away. They both knew it. Gaston lowered his face toward hers. "Try me." 2 words. That was all. No reassurance. No speech about how beautiful she was. Just a challenge from a man who seemed genuinely irritated that she'd decided what he could desire without consulting him. Lula stared into his eyes. Then she grabbed his tie and kissed him. Lula had no idea that kissing Gaston Luciano would soon become the least dangerous thing happening inside her flower shop. Because someone in his world had already noticed her. And before Gaston could figure out why, 8 innocent flowers would pull Lula straight into a betrayal that had begun long before he ever walked through her door. Before we find out exactly how Lula ended up in the arms of the most dangerous man she'd ever met, tell me in the comments, what's your favorite flower, and where in the world are you watching from? I love seeing how far our stories travel. And if you enjoy romance with danger, tension, and a little chaos, subscribe and settle in. Now, back to Lula. Before Gaston Luciano turned her flower shop, and her heart completely upside down. The lilies were the first problem. Not because they were wrong exactly. They were fresh, white-tipped, opening at exactly the right angle for a Monday morning. Lula had sourced them herself from the wholesale market on Atlantic Avenue before the sun had finished deciding whether to bother rising, which was the kind of dedication Wild at Heart's modest profit margins absolutely did not compensate her for, but that she performed anyway, because bad flowers felt like a personal failure. The lilies were not the problem. The man holding them like they had personally offended his entire bloodline. That was the problem. He'd walked in at 9:47. Lula knew this because she'd been watching the clock, waiting for her delivery of garden roses to arrive, silently composing a strongly worded text to her supplier that she would never actually send because she needed him too much to afford honesty. When the bell above the door chimed, she looked up expecting Marcus and his battered van. She did not get Marcus and his battered van. She got 6 feet and several inches of dark suit, dark hair, and an expression so controlled it looked like it had been ironed on each morning, along with the rest of him. The man stepped inside Wild at Heart, the way people step into rooms they've already decided are beneath them, but are prepared to tolerate briefly. Lula placed him immediately, late 30s maybe, the kind of handsome that didn't announce itself. It simply arrived and waited for you to catch up. Strong jaw, sharp eyes, shoulders built like an argument you were going to lose. She noticed all of this in approximately 3 seconds. Then she noticed him looking at the lilies. Specifically, she noticed the way his jaw had tightened, as though the flowers had said something that required a formal response. "Can I help you?" Lula asked. "Funeral arrangement." His voice was low, even, the kind of voice that didn't require volume to fill a room. "I need it by Thursday." "Condolences," Lula said. She moved around the counter. "Who was it for? Do you know what they—" "White lilies." He said it like it was already decided. Lula looked at the bucket of white lilies he was still regarding with quiet antagonism. You want white lilies for a funeral arrangement. That's what funerals require. Sometimes. She tilted her head. Can I ask, do you want it to look like every other funeral arrangement the guest of honor has probably seen at every other funeral they've attended for the last 50 years? Or would you like something that actually reflects who they were? The man looked at her. Not in the way people looked at her when she pushed back on their order. Most customers either caved immediately or got defensive. This man simply looked at her, steadily and without apparent emotion, as though he were filing the moment away, somewhere behind those very dark eyes, for consideration at a more convenient time. They were family, he said. Then tell me something about them. A pause. It lasted long enough that Lula genuinely wasn't certain he'd answer. She grew things, he said. In a garden. She preferred things that came back. Lula absorbed this. Then she went to work. She pulled ranunculus, soft, layered, persimmon and cream, and white sweet peas that spiraled at the edges, and a base of eucalyptus that smelled like something between clean linen and the outdoors. She added 3 stems of white lily because the man clearly had feelings about white lilies that she respected if not entirely understood, and she was not in the business of emotional warfare with grieving customers. When she set the arrangement on the counter, she watched him look at it. Nothing moved in his face. Then he said, "That isn't what I asked for." "No," Lula agreed pleasantly. "It's better." She grew things that came back. Ranunculus comes back every year. Sweet peas climb, which is... She paused. Actually, sweet peas are annuals, but they reseed themselves, which is essentially the same philosophical point. He looked at her again. That same unhurried, careful look. Lula looked back without apology. She had spent enough years behind this counter to know that the customers who argued most at the beginning were usually the ones who sent thank you cards afterward. Not that she expected a thank you card from this particular customer. He bought the arrangement. He didn't say it was beautiful. He didn't say anything at all, actually. He simply set down cash, too much of it, and in a denomination that suggested he'd produced it from a suit pocket and not a wallet, and lifted the arrangement with a steadiness that surprised her slightly, like a man who understood that fragile things needed to be handled correctly, even when that ran against his instincts. The bell above the door chimed again. Lula put the money in the register, made change she didn't have anyone to give, and went back to watching for Marcus. It was 11 minutes later, while she was trimming the thorns off a batch of garden roses that had finally arrived, that her phone buzzed with a text from B. "Please tell me you didn't just sell flowers to Gaston Luciano without knowing who he is." Lula looked at the too large bill still sitting on the register. She looked back at her phone. "Define who he is," she typed back. 3 seconds later, her phone rang. Bea's definition of who he is took 4 minutes and involved 0 pauses for breath. Lula sat on her workbench stool, phone pressed to her ear, and listened to her cousin describe Gaston Luciano the way a nature documentary might describe an apex predator, with equal parts scientific detail and the strong implication that encountering one in the wild was inadvisable. "The Luciano family has controlled most of South Brooklyn since before either of us was born," Bea said. "Gaston took over at 32 after his father died. Nobody disputed it. That's all you need to know about Gaston Luciano." Lula looked at the spot where he'd stood. "He was very particular about the lilies," she said. "Lula. He also paid in cash, large bills. Lula, I need you to hear me. I heard you. He's terrifying. He bought ranunculus." A pause on Bea's end that communicated an entire paragraph of exasperation. "Just," Bea started, "be normal if he comes back. I'm always normal. You told a city councilman his boutonniere looked like it was dying of shame. It was a carnation dyed blue. It was dying of shame." Bea hung up. Lula set her phone down and went back to her roses. She was entirely sure Gaston Luciano would not come back. Men like that sent assistants for subsequent arrangements. They didn't return themselves to a 400-square-foot flower shop in Carroll Gardens that had a slightly unreliable front door hinge and a hand-painted sign her grandmother had commissioned in 1987. He came back on Wednesday, not Thursday, when the funeral was, which might have made practical sense. Wednesday, 2 days after the first visit, at 10:15 in the morning, when Lula was up to her elbows in a centerpiece order for a Carroll Gardens restaurant that had very strong opinions about dahlias. The bell chimed. She looked up. Her hands kept moving because her hands were professionals even when the rest of her was momentarily caught off guard. Gaston stepped inside wearing a different suit, charcoal this time instead of black, and the same unreadable expression. He looked around wild at heart the way he had on Monday, taking in the crowded buckets, the ceiling-hung dried arrangements, the chalkboard wall where Lula had written the week's seasonal offerings in her grandmother's handwriting, which she'd spent 3 years practicing to match. His gaze found her. The arrangement was appropriate, he said. Lula pulled a stem of burgundy dahlia from the bucket beside her and trimmed the end. I'm glad. I need another one. She looked up. Another funeral arrangement? Something almost imperceptible shifted in his expression. Table arrangement. For a dinner. Formal or informal? He considered this with the gravity of someone being asked to broker a peace treaty. Formal. Occasion? Business. Right. Lula set down her shears. Color preferences? Anything you want to avoid? Nothing purple. She waited. My mother believes purple flowers at dinner predict an argument, he said. She's wrong, but it isn't worth discussing. Lula stared at him. He looked back at her steadily, as though he hadn't just offered her the most unexpectedly human piece of information she could have imagined receiving from him. She turned away to hide whatever her face was doing. Smart woman, your mother, Lula said, pulling cream roses and garden green amaranthus from their buckets. I'm not saying purple flowers predict arguments. I'm saying the psychological effect of color on dining atmosphere is documented, and warm tones improve conversation. A pause. That's what she says, Gaston said. Then she's right twice. Lula built the arrangement without further conversation, which should have felt awkward given that he simply stood on the other side of the counter watching her work. It didn't, though. Most people who watched her work fidgeted or asked unnecessary questions or tried to direct the process. Gaston watched the way he seemed to do most things, without apology, without narration, with complete and slightly unnerving attention. She caught herself being more precise than the order required, which was ridiculous, and she noted it and set it aside. When she wrapped the arrangement, his hand was already on the counter. Their fingers didn't touch during the exchange. There were maybe 2 inches between his hand and hers when she passed it across. Lula was aware of the 2 inches in a way that annoyed her. He paid again. Cash. Too much again. You can start a tab, she said. If you're planning to continue having this many dinners, is that an option? For regular customers, yes. He looked at her for a moment. Then I'm a regular customer, he said. He left. Lula stood very still for 3 seconds. Then she turned around, walked to her cold storage room, stood in the refrigerated air for approximately 1 minute, and emerged having made a series of private decisions she intended to keep. She was writing up the tab card, last name Luciano, first name she was going to have to figure out how to ask for casually, when the bell chimed again. A man she didn't recognize came in. Heavy-set, unremarkable coat, a face that seemed specifically designed not to be remembered. I need an arrangement, he said. 7 white roses, 1 center flower, burgundy, very dark, no substitutions. He put both hands on the counter, especially the center flower. Lula looked at him. Strange order, strangely specific. She thought of the nearly black dahlias in her back cooler, the ones she'd ordered for the restaurant's centerpieces, wine dark and a little severe for her taste. I can do that, she said. She didn't know yet that she shouldn't. Outside, through Wild at Heart's front window, A black car sat at the curb. Inside it, Nico Romano watched his boss instruct the driver to circle the block one more time, for no reason Nico could identify, and said nothing whatsoever. He didn't ask her to dinner so much as inform her that dinner was a reasonable next step, which Lula found so spectacularly presumptuous that she almost admired it. It had happened on his fourth visit, which was ostensibly for a hostess gift arrangement, a request so transparent that even Lula, who was committed to not reading into anything, had noticed Bia's text arriving within 40 seconds of Gaston leaving the shop. 4 times, Lula. He needs a lot of flowers, Lula had typed back. He needs reading glasses, is what he needs, Bia replied, because he is clearly not seeing the situation clearly. The dinner invitation, such as it was, had arrived at the end of that fourth visit. Gaston had watched her wrap the hostess arrangement, and then said, with the same tone a man might use to confirm a quarterly projection, "I'd like to take you to dinner." Lula had looked up. "Would you?" she said. "Friday, 8 o'clock. There's a restaurant on—" "You might want to ask first," Lula said, "rather than scheduling." A pause. Something moved through his expression. Not embarrassment exactly, more like a man encountering a procedure he hadn't previously been required to follow. "Would you like to have dinner with me?" he said. "Friday." That wasn't a question. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Would you like to have dinner with me? Friday, please." Lula considered making him hold that for another moment. She decided she'd made the point. "Yes," she said, "I would." The restaurant was not what she'd braced for. She'd half expected somewhere designed to intimidate. All white tablecloths and sommeliers who looked at you like a math problem they were too polite to solve aloud. Instead, it was small and warmly lit, a place that smelled like good olive oil and wood smoke, where the owner greeted Gaston by name and pulled out Lula's chair without any of the performance that usually accompanied such gestures. Gaston had been there before her. Of course he had. He struck her as someone who was constitutionally incapable of arriving second to anything. He stood when she came in, which she hadn't expected, and for a moment, before she reached the table, his gaze moved over her. Not quickly, not furtively, just a look, steady and direct, the way he seemed to do everything. She was wearing a dress the color of deep amber, fitted and deliberate, her hair down, and she was not going to analyze whatever that look meant, because that was a door she was keeping firmly closed.
She sat.
The owner produced wine without being asked. "You come here often," Lula said, "when the occasion warrants it." "What occasions usually warrant it?" Gaston considered the question with more seriousness than it required. "Previously, business. Occasionally, family. And tonight?" He looked at her across the table. The candlelight did things to his face that she was also not going to analyze. "Tonight is different," he said simply. Lula reached for her wine. The conversation, against all reasonable expectation, was good. Not performed dinner date good, where both people are essentially auditioning. Actually good, the kind that moved without effort, that surprised her twice before the appetizers arrived. He asked about her grandmother early, and without preamble, the way he seemed to approach most things directly, rather than circling. "Bia mentioned her?" Lula asked. "Your shop." He nodded toward her. "The sign. The handwriting on the chalkboard. It's not yours." Lula set down her fork. The observation was so precise and so quietly delivered that for a moment she didn't know what to do with it. "My grandmother June," she said. "She opened the shop in 1987, left it to me when she died 4 years ago. You maintained her handwriting on the board. I practiced for 3 years to match it." She paused. "That probably sounds—" "No," he said. "Just that. No qualifier, no elaboration." The single word closed the sentence without dismissing it, and somehow that was more comforting than if he'd said something reassuring and predictable. Lula looked at him. "She taught you flowers," he said. "She taught me everything." Lula turned her wine glass slowly. She used to say flowers tell the truth when people can't manage it, which is either very wise or very sad, depending on the day. Both, Gaston said. Both, she agreed. A pause settled between them that didn't need filling. Then, because fairness required it, you know almost nothing about flowers, Lula said, for someone who purchases them at your frequency. Something moved in his expression that might, on a different face, have been caught. I know what I want, he said. You wanted white lilies for a grief arrangement. I was wrong about the lilies. You were. She studied him. Why flowers? Specifically, most men in your, she paused, choosing the word, position, send assistance. Gaston was quiet for a moment. The shop is quieter than most places I go, he said. It wasn't the whole answer, she could tell that, but it was a true piece of one, offered without decoration, and she found she respected him more for not constructing something elegant to hide behind. She was about to ask something else, something that would have moved them into territory neither of them was ready for, when Gaston's phone, which had sat face down and silent on the table, lit up. He glanced at it. His expression didn't change. But something behind it did. I apologize, he said. He was already rising, jacket buttoned. There's a situation that requires... Go, Lula said. He looked at her. I mean it, she said. Go handle whatever it is. He held her gaze for one moment longer than necessary. Then he did something she didn't expect. He picked up her hand from the table, not urgently, not dramatically, just lifted it, held it briefly, set it back down. I'll call you, he said. That also wasn't a question, Lula said. No, he agreed. It wasn't. He was gone in 30 seconds. Lula sat alone at the table, her hand still warm where he'd held it, and finished her wine. She was reaching for her coat when her own phone buzzed. A news alert, local Brooklyn feed, the kind she kept on for neighborhood deliveries. Breaking. Luciano-linked warehouse on the Red Hook waterfront reportedly breached. Details developing. Lula read it twice. Then she thought, without meaning to, about the strange arrangement she'd filled 3 days ago. 7 white roses, 1 nearly black center, delivered to a Red Hook address. She told herself it was a coincidence. She almost believed it. The gardenias arrived on a Tuesday with no card. Lula found them on the workbench when she came in from the cold storage room. A generous bunch of them, creamy white and densely fragrant, wrapped in brown paper and tied with plain twine. No florist's label, no delivery slip. Nothing to indicate where they'd come from, except that they were exceptional quality, the kind she sourced herself from a specialty grower in New Jersey, whose waitlist alone took 6 months to get onto. She stood looking at them for a long moment. Then she picked one up and held it. Gardenias meant secret love. This was not obscure knowledge. It was in every floral symbolism reference she'd owned since she was 14, annotated in her grandmother's handwriting in the margins of the oldest one. Gardenias were what you sent when you wanted someone to know without quite being willing to say it directly. Lula set the flower down. She was not going to jump to conclusions about a bunch of flowers that could have come from anyone, including a supplier sending samples, including a neighboring business with the wrong delivery address, including approximately 40 other explanations that did not involve Gaston Luciano having looked up flower meanings. She texted B anyway. Someone left gardenias on my workbench. No card. B's response arrived in under 10 seconds. How many? Lula counted. 14. A pause that felt deliberate even over text. That's not a supplier sample, Lula. Lula put her phone face down on the counter and went to work. He came in at 11. Not unusual anymore. His visits had settled into a pattern she'd stopped pretending not to notice. Roughly every 2 to 3 days. Always in the morning. Always with a reason that became progressively less convincing. Last week it had been a centerpiece for a meeting room. The week before, a single orchid for his office. which even the most charitable interpretation could not stretch into necessity. Today he said he needed a weekly standing order. Cut stems, seasonal variety, for the front hall of a building he described only as a property he maintained. A standing order, Lula said. Weekly, Tuesdays. She wrote it in the order book. She could feel him watching her write it. I'll need a delivery address. He gave her one in Brooklyn Heights. She wrote that too. The gardenias, she said, without looking up from the book. A pause. Were they acceptable? Gaston asked. Lula looked up. His expression was composed, as always, but there was something underneath the composure that was paying very close attention to her answer. They were beautiful, she said. Exceptional quality. I was curious where you sourced them. I have a contact. The Delancey grower in New Jersey. Something shifted in his face. Almost surprise. Quickly contained. You know him. His wait list is 6 months. She held Gaston's gaze. You went on it before you'd met me. The implication sat between them, quiet and rather large. Gaston said nothing, which was, she was learning, frequently his most eloquent response. Lula closed the order book. Gardenias mean secret love, she said, in the Victorian flower language, which you clearly researched. I looked several things up, he said, without any particular embarrassment. Did you? Ranunculus means, I am dazzled by your charms. He said this with the same gravity he probably applied to quarterly financial strategy. I considered it excessive for a first arrangement. Lula stared at him. The laughter arrived before she could stop it. Genuine, unguarded, the kind that escaped before her better judgment could intercept it. Gaston watched her laugh the way he watched most things, carefully, and with what she was beginning to identify as poorly concealed satisfaction. That is the most unexpectedly charming thing you've said to me, she told him when she'd recovered. I wasn't attempting charm, he said. I was explaining a sourcing decision. Of course you were. Carmela Luciano arrived at Wild at Heart at 2 in the afternoon, which Lula would later understand was not a coincidence, but which presented itself as one. She was 67 and moved through the door with the ease of someone who had never found a room she couldn't make her own. Silver-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing good clothes, with the carelessness of someone who'd stopped thinking about them decades ago. She went directly to the seasonal display and picked up a stem of hellebore, examining it with genuine knowledge. These are well kept, she said. The neck usually droops if they're not conditioned properly. Submerged overnight, Lula said, all the way to the bloom. Carmela looked up, her eyes, dark, precise, clearly the origin of a particular quality in her son's gaze, assessed Lula with warmth rather than calculation. You're Lula, she said. I am. Lula tilted her head. And you're not here for hellebore. Carmela smiled. It rearranged her whole face into something that explained, suddenly, how Gaston had learned to be quietly devastating. No, she agreed. But I do want some. Do you have dahlias? The café au lait variety? In the back cooler. Come with me. They spent 40 minutes together, which surprised Lula, and apparently surprised neither Carmela nor, later, B, when told about it. Carmela knew her soil composition, her planting cycles, the specific microclimate of her garden on the south-facing slope of the property she described without naming. She asked Lula intelligent questions and received the answers with genuine interest rather than polite performance. She was, Lula realized, the person who had taught a serious man to notice what grew back. At the end, loading a generous selection into paper carriers, Carmela paused at the door. My son doesn't visit places he doesn't intend to return to, she said, conversational, light. He never has, not since he was small. Lula held the door. He returns here, Carmela said simply. She left. Lula stood in the doorway of Wild at Heart for a moment, the autumn air cold against her face, thinking about a man who'd gone on a 6-month wait list for flowers he hadn't yet had a reason to give. Behind her, Her phone buzzed on the counter. A new order submission through the website. Paid in advance, cash equivalent transfer, no account name attached. 7 white roses. 1 center flower, burgundy, very dark. The instruction at the bottom read, "No substitutions, especially the center flower." Lula read it standing up. Then she read it again, sitting down. The red hook breach had been on a Thursday. She pulled up her order log. The first strange arrangement, the one she'd filled for the unremarkable man with the forgettable face, had been delivered to a Red Hook address on the Monday prior. This new order had a delivery address in Sunset Park. Her hand hovered over the keyboard. She thought about coincidences. She thought about what her grandmother used to say about patterns, that the flowers always told the truth, if you paid enough attention. Then she thought about Gaston leaving dinner the same night a warehouse was breached. She filled the order. But this time, she wrote the address down in a separate notebook, dated it, and kept it, just in case the truth was trying to tell her something. The benefit was Carmela's idea, which meant Gaston attended it, which meant Lula saw him in a context she hadn't prepared for. It was a charity event, historic preservation, a Carroll Gardens foundation that Carmela supported with the quiet consistency of someone who believed in institutions outlasting individuals. Lula had been asked to provide the floral arrangements 3 weeks prior, before Gaston had become a regular fixture in her life, before gardenias and standing orders and dinners that ended with her hand warm from his. She hadn't mentioned it to him. He hadn't mentioned it to her. So when Lula arrived at 7 to check that her arrangements had survived the venue's handling, they hadn't, entirely, and she spent 20 minutes correcting a centerpiece that someone had rotated to face the wrong direction. She was not expecting to look up and find Gaston across the room. She was also not expecting the woman beside him. She was extraordinary in the specific way that made a room quietly reorganize itself. Tall, angular, dressed in something architecturally severe that suggested she had opinions about everything and the credentials to support them. She was speaking to Gaston with the ease of long familiarity, one hand briefly on his arm, laughing at something he'd said, or hadn't said, since Gaston's silences apparently also qualified as wit in some circles. Lula watched this for approximately 4 seconds. Then she turned back to the centerpiece and finished correcting it with slightly more precision than necessary. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was a vendor at this event, not a guest, and that Gaston Luciano's social life was none of her business and had never been offered to her as such. She was very convincing, right up until she overheard 2 women behind her, voices low and carrying in the particular way of people who believe ambient noise covers them. Always thought he'd end up with Valentina eventually. They make sense together. She's exactly what that world expects. You know what I mean. Polished. Appropriate. Lula set down the stem she was holding. She picked it back up. She finished the arrangement. Then she gathered her kit, told the venue coordinator she was leaving, and was halfway to the door when Gaston said her name. Not loudly. He didn't raise his voice. He said it once, at a normal register, and somehow it carried. She stopped. She turned around. He was crossing the room toward her, the extraordinary woman no longer beside him, his expression doing the thing it did when he'd noticed something and was determining what to do about it. "You're leaving," he said. "My work here is done. You didn't say you were providing the arrangements. You didn't say you were attending." She kept her voice light. Professional. "The centerpieces are set, you're all in good hands." She turned to go. Lula. Something in the way he said it that time made her close her eyes briefly before she turned back. He was closer than he'd been. Not crowding her, he never crowded, but close enough that she could see the careful attention in his face, the way he was reading her, the way she sometimes read difficult customers, looking for the thing underneath the thing they were saying. "What happened?" he said. "It wasn't a question. Nothing happened. I finished early. You've been finishing arrangements since I walked in. You were checking that one centerpiece for 20 minutes. It was rotated wrong. Lula. She looked at him directly, which was a mistake, because he looked back with the same directness he brought to everything, and the two women's voices were still sitting somewhere behind her sternum, like a splinter she couldn't locate. "Who is she?" Lula asked. She kept her tone neutral, curious, reasonable. "Valentina Greco." He said it without hesitation. "Her family has a business relationship with mine that goes back 15 years. She's also engaged to a man in Milan, which I could have told you before you decided to leave without speaking to me." Lula absorbed this. "I wasn't." "You were," he said, simply, without accusation. The room moved around them. People in expensive clothing, servers with trays, the low hum of string quartet tuning in the corner. Nobody was looking at them. They were standing in a space that felt, regardless of the crowd, entirely private. "It's not about her," Lula said. "Then what is it about?" She looked at him. The suit, the face, the way a room deferred to him without his asking, and the splinter found its nerve. "Look at you," she said quietly. "Then, look at me." Gaston looked at her, slowly, without apology or performance. His gaze moved over her face, her shoulders, the green dress she'd chosen that morning because it made her feel like herself, and returned to her eyes. "I am," he said. "That's not what I—" She exhaled. "There are women in this room who make sense beside you, who fit, who belong in—" She gestured vaguely at the architecture of his life. "All of this." Silence. Something crossed Gaston's face that she hadn't seen before. Not hurt, harder than hurt. Something close to genuine offense. The kind that comes not from a wound, but from a premise so wrong it requires correction before anything else can proceed. He moved, one step toward her. Lula moved back without deciding to, and then again, until the wall of the corridor alcove met her shoulders. Gaston stopped directly in front of her. He didn't touch her. He raised one hand and placed it flat against the wall beside her head, leaving space, leaving her every exit intact, and lowered his face toward hers. His eyes stayed on hers. "I'm too big for you," Lula said. The words came out steadier than she felt. Silence. Then his expression shifted, something between confusion and a slow, controlled anger, directed not at her, but at whoever had taught her to say that about herself. "Try me," he said. 2 words. No speech about her beauty. No reassurance designed to be received and discarded. Just a challenge from a man who seemed genuinely, quietly furious at the suggestion that he hadn't already decided exactly what he wanted. Lula looked into his eyes. She grabbed his tie and kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't a question. His free hand found her waist, and she felt the careful deliberateness of it, the same quality he brought to everything. Nothing accidental, nothing wasted. And the kiss deepened in a way that made the string quartet and the expensive clothing and the 2 women with their reasonable observations disappear entirely. When she pulled back, his forehead rested briefly against hers. His hand was still at her waist. "Stop telling me what I want," he said quietly. Lula's heart was doing something complicated and structural. "I'm working on it," she said. His thumb moved once at her waist. Just once, and then he straightened, composure resettling around him like a jacket, though something in his eyes hadn't quite finished returning to its usual position. "Have dinner with me," he said. "Not a question." "Still not a question." "I know." Lula laughed despite herself. She was still holding his tie. She let go. "Friday," she said. He nodded once. Then he went back into the room, and Lula stood in the alcove for a moment, with her back against the wall, and both hands pressed to her burning face, and thought about what her grandmother had said about flowers telling the truth, when people couldn't manage it. She was starting to think Gaston Luciano had been managing it all along. She just hadn't been listening in the right language. Her phone buzzed in her kit bag. A new order notification from the Wild at Heart website. 7 white roses. 1 center flower. Very dark burgundy. No substitutions. Especially the center flower. Delivery address. Sunset Park. The same address she'd written in her notebook 3 days ago and hadn't yet been able to explain. Lula stared at the screen. The splinter in her sternum moved and became something colder and more specific. She'd already filled this order once. Friday arrived the way good things sometimes did. Quietly, without announcement, giving Lula no time to talk herself out of it. Gaston picked her up at 7:30. Not a car service this time. He drove, which she hadn't expected, a dark car that was neither ostentatious nor apologetic about what it cost. He got out when she came down the steps of her building, which she also hadn't expected, and she watched him cross to her side of the car with that particular economy of movement he had, like someone who'd long ago stopped performing anything. He looked at her for a moment in the amber light of the street lamp. "Green again," he said. "I like green." "I know." He opened the door. Lula got in before he could see whatever her face was doing. Dinner was at Carmela's house. This information had been withheld until they were 3 blocks away, which Lula considered a tactical move deserving of acknowledgement. "You could have mentioned this earlier," she said. "You might have reconsidered. I might have worn something different. You look fine." A pause. "You look better than fine." "I said that wrong." Lula turned to look at him. Gaston kept his eyes on the road, with the focused attention of a man who had possibly never said anything he wanted to immediately rephrase in his entire adult life, and was finding the experience novel. "Better than fine," she repeated. "Yes. High praise." "From me," he said. "It is." She faced forward again, and was very careful not to smile where he could see it. Carmela's house in Cobble Hill was warm and unreasonably good-smelling, the kind of home that had been lived in deliberately for decades. She met them at the door in an apron that had genuine sauce on it, kissed Gaston's cheek, and then took both of Lula's hands in hers and looked at her with the frank approval of someone who had been waiting to do exactly this. "I told him to bring you weeks ago," Carmela said. "He takes his time about things." "Mama," Gaston said. "Sit down, both of you." They sat. The meal was extraordinary in the way that had nothing to do with showmanship. Pasta, braised short rib, bread that had clearly been made that morning, and the conversation moved between the 3 of them with a naturalness that Lula hadn't anticipated. Carmela asked about Wild at Heart, with genuine curiosity, asked about June with genuine respect, and told a story about Gaston at 14, attempting to grow tomatoes on the fire escape that he endured with the stillness of a man accepting a sentence he'd known was coming. "They were adequate tomatoes," he said. "They were gray," Carmela said cheerfully. Lula pressed her lips together. "Something to say?" Gaston asked. "Not a single thing," Lula said. After dinner, Carmela disappeared into the kitchen with a decisiveness that left no ambiguity about her intentions, and Lula found herself beside Gaston on the back steps overlooking Carmela's garden, dormant now in November, but structured, clearly loved, cut back with the care of someone who understood that tending things through winter was an act of faith. The air was cold and still. Gaston had removed his jacket and set it around her shoulders before she'd registered the intention, the gesture so practiced and unconscious that it clearly wasn't performed. He sat beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without their arms touching. "She likes you," he said. "She's remarkable. She's frequently inconvenient." But the way he said it, Lula looked at him sideways. "You adore her." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. A comfortable silence stretched between them. The garden was silver and quiet. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked twice and stopped. "Eric?" Lula said. She hadn't planned to say it. But the evening had been warm, and Carmela's house had the particular quality of places where true things became easier to say, and Gaston had been sitting beside her without requiring anything, and somehow the name came out before she'd voted on it. Gaston waited. "He was my fiancé," she said. "Or close enough to it. 3 years." She turned the edge of his jacket between her fingers. He was very good at saying things that weren't quite insults, very good at framing them as concern. What kind of things? It wasn't a question. It was an invitation, left open. That certain clothes weren't flattering. That I'd be beautiful if, she kept her voice even. That men had preferences, and he was being honest with me, which was a kindness, actually, if I thought about it. She exhaled. I got very good at thinking about it exactly the way he wanted me to. Gaston said nothing for a moment. He cheated, she added, which was clarifying. Did you know? I suspected. I didn't want to be the kind of woman who was also suspicious on top of everything else, so I chose not to. She paused. Which is the part I'm still working on forgiving myself for. Gaston turned to look at her. His expression was quiet, serious, and entirely without the pity she'd have found unbearable. You were trusting someone, he said. That isn't a flaw. It's naive. It's human. A beat. What he did with it is his character, not yours. Lula looked at him. I'm not good at being desired, she said carefully. By certain men. I know what that sounds like. It sounds accurate, he said, given what you were taught. She held his gaze. Something in the steadiness of his face, the absence of impatience, the absence of performance, moved through her with a warmth she felt physically. Your turn, she said quietly. You said your world taught you that anything loved becomes leverage. He looked at the garden. My father was a careful man, Gaston said. Careful about what he showed, what he admitted to. He paused. He loved my mother completely. He also spent 30 years terrified that someone would use that to reach him. His jaw moved. It made him controlling. Not cruel, but he held on too tightly, and she lived in a beautiful house that sometimes felt like a perimeter. Lula was very still. I learned from him, Gaston said, which means I learned both things. That love is real, and that my first instinct when I'm frightened is to build a wall around whatever I'm frightened of losing. He said it simply, without drama, like a man reading from a document he'd studied long enough to recite accurately. Thank you for telling me that, Lula said. He looked back at her. The cold had deepened without either of them moving inside, and his jacket was warm on her shoulders and his face was close in the November dark, and the moment stretched between them with the particular weight of things that were about to change. His hand found hers on the step between them. Not urgently, just his fingers covering hers, steady and warm. Lula turned her hand over. They stayed like that while the garden stayed silver and quiet around them. Later, the evening wound down with Carmela's coffee and a story about the garden's original owner that lasted a beautiful 20 minutes. Gaston drove her home. He walked her to her door. At the top of the steps, she turned. He was one step below, which put them at the same height, and the street lamp caught the line of his face in a way that was genuinely unfair. Come inside, Lula said. She'd surprised herself. His eyes held hers. Are you sure? He said, quietly. Not a condition, a question, real and unhurried. I'm sure I'm asking, she said. That's where I am right now. Something in his expression softened in a way she'd never seen before. Not less serious. Something underneath the seriousness, briefly visible. Then I'm coming inside, he said. Much later, the bedroom was dark and quiet. His forehead had rested against hers, and she had looked at him, and he had said, Tell me to stop. And she hadn't. She had reached for him instead. The rest was theirs. Morning came in gray and gentle through the curtains she'd never gotten around to replacing with something that actually blocked light. Gaston was awake before her. She registered this as she surfaced. The particular quality of stillness beside someone who is conscious. He was on his back, looking at the ceiling, one arm beside her without quite holding her, as though he'd debated the gesture and landed on proximity over presumption. Lula looked at him for a moment before he knew she was awake. He looked, in the gray morning light, like a version of himself that existed only here. The discipline was still there. It was constitutive. She was starting to understand. Not a mask, but without the room to perform it for, it sat differently. Quieter. She moved slightly. He looked at her. "The ceiling is fine," she said. "Nothing's going to happen to it." Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. His arm moved to rest more deliberately against her shoulder. They lay there for a while in the gray morning quiet, and Lula thought about walls built around things you were frightened of losing, and flowers that said what people were too frightened to say, and a notebook in her shop with 2 delivery addresses dated 7 days apart. The warmth beside her was real. So was the cold thing in her chest that had been sitting there since the second order arrived. She needed to tell him. She just needed to figure out how to say it without changing everything. She suspected it was going to change everything anyway. She brought the notebook on a Tuesday. Not because Tuesday was significant, but because she'd spent the better part of a week finding reasons it could wait. The pattern wasn't conclusive. She might be wrong. Correlation wasn't causation. She was a florist, and not whatever the word was for someone who decoded criminal logistics through flower orders. But the Sunset Park delivery had gone out on a Wednesday. On Thursday, Lula had read a brief item in the local news about a Luciano-connected distribution route being disrupted. 4 sentences. No names. The kind of article that didn't explain itself because it assumed its readers already understood the shape of the story. She'd sat with that for 4 days. Then she'd picked up the notebook and driven to the address Gaston had given her once, the Brooklyn Heights building with the standing weekly order, and told the man at the front desk she needed to see him. The man at the front desk had looked at her with the particular blankness of someone trained to give nothing away. 40 seconds later, Gaston had appeared. He read her face before she spoke. "Come up," he said. The office was not what she'd imagined, though she'd have struggled to say what she had imagined. It was spare and ordered. Bookshelves, a desk that faced the door, a window overlooking the street below. It smelled like coffee and paper. It looked like a place where decisions were made by someone who didn't need the room to announce that. Nico was there when they entered, standing near the window with a coffee he set down when he saw Lula's expression. She put the notebook on the desk. "I need you to look at this," she said to Gaston. He looked at her first. Then he sat, opened the notebook, and read. She'd laid it out the way she organized everything, clearly, chronologically, with the logic visible. 3 orders, each identical in specification. 3 delivery dates, 3 addresses. Beside each address, a date-stamped news item she'd printed and folded into the pages, the Red Hook breach, the distribution route disruption, and a 3rd incident she'd tracked to the Sunset Park delivery, a quiet item about a Luciano meeting location being compromised. Each arrangement had been ordered by a different person. Each order had used the identical phrasing. No substitutions, especially the center flower. Each delivery had preceded a security breach by 4 to 7 days. Gaston read through it without speaking. Nico moved to stand behind him and read over his shoulder, and the quality of silence in the room changed in a way Lula felt in her sternum. When Gaston looked up, his expression was completely controlled. "How long have you been tracking this?" he said. "Since the 2nd order. I noticed it properly after the 3rd. She met his eyes. "I didn't know what it was. I filled the orders because they were orders. I didn't know they were—" She stopped. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," he said. Immediately, without qualification. Something in her chest released slightly. Nico straightened. Different intermediaries each time. Different people, same instruction, word for word. Lula turned to face him. "I remember unusual orders. This arrangement isn't something a customer develops independently. 7 white roses, with 1 near black dahlia at the center. It's specific." And the phrasing isn't how people naturally talk about flowers. Nico looked at Gaston. Gaston looked at the notebook. The addresses, he said. What were the delivery locations? A restaurant in Red Hook, a commercial building in Sunset Park. The third. She opened the notebook to the page. A private residence in Windsor Terrace. Nico took out his phone. Gaston stood. He moved to the window, which Lula was beginning to understand was what he did when he needed to think without an audience reading his face. She waited. You investigated 3 of our operations being compromised, he said, to the window. Separately, electronically, we found nothing. You were looking at electronics, Lula said. Nobody looked at flowers. A pause. No, he said. Nobody looked at flowers. He turned around. His face was composed, and she had learned enough of him by now to see the thing underneath the composure. Not fear, something colder than fear. The specific anger of a person who has identified a violation they can't immediately address because they don't yet know its full shape. You should have told me sooner, he said. I wasn't sure sooner. She held his gaze. I'm sure now. He accepted this. Whatever he might have preferred her to do differently, he set it aside visibly, the way she'd seen him do before, filing things in order of current usefulness. These orders came through your website, he said. Cash equivalent transfer, no account name on 2 of them. The first one was walk-in, paid cash. We'll need everything. Payment records, timestamps, any contact information they gave. I brought copies. She produced a folded sheaf of papers from her bag. Order confirmations, delivery receipts, my own notes. Gaston took them. He looked at the papers, then at her, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite what she expected from a man processing an intelligence breach in his own organization. It was closer to the look from the steps outside Carmela's garden. You documented all of this, he said. Alone. I'm a florist, she said. I keep records. Nico made a sound that was very nearly a laugh, quickly converted. Gaston moved around the desk toward her. He stopped close, not urgently, but deliberately, and his hand came up to her face, just his thumb at her jaw, brief and careful. Thank you, he said quietly. It was the most unguarded thing she'd heard him say, in a room with another person present. Lula nodded. Then Nico's phone rang, and both men's attention shifted with the focused precision of people whose professional instincts ran deep and fast, and Nico said 3 words that made Gaston's hand drop from her face and his expression close into something she didn't have a name for yet. They hit Bay Ridge. Gaston looked at the notebook, then at Lula. Stay here, he said. He meant it kindly. That wasn't going to be the problem. The threat arrived on a Wednesday morning in the form of a delivery. Not through the website this time. Hand-delivered, left on Wild at Heart's doorstep before Lula arrived to open up. A single arrangement, no wrapping, set directly on the top step where she couldn't miss it. 7 white roses. 1 burgundy dahlia at the center, so dark it was nearly black. No order slip, no name, no delivery address. Just the arrangement, facing the door, like a statement. Lula stood on the sidewalk, looking at it for a long moment. The morning was cold and gray, a delivery truck rumbling past on the street behind her, a woman walking a dog who glanced at the flowers without breaking stride. She took a photograph. Then she called Gaston. He arrived in 11 minutes, which told her things about where he'd been and how fast he'd moved that she filed away without comment. Nico was with him. They both looked at the arrangement with the same controlled expression people wore when they were thinking faster than they were speaking. Gaston turned to her. Did you touch it? No. I photographed it and called you. He looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite the opposite. Good, he said. Then he made 3 phone calls in under 4 minutes, and by the time Lula had unlocked the shop and put the kettle on because her hands needed something to do, 2 men she didn't recognize were outside on the sidewalk, and a third was speaking quietly to Nico near the door. She understood, watching this, that the strange arrangement had stopped being a pattern and become a message, directed at her specifically. The estate was in Staten Island, gated, set back from the road behind mature trees that blocked the sightlines from the street, with the thoroughness of careful planning rather than happy landscaping. The house itself was substantial without being theatrical. It had the quality of a place built for function first, with aesthetics arriving later as a secondary consideration. Lula knew all of this because she was sitting in its kitchen at 9 in the evening, and she had been there since 2 in the afternoon, and nobody had asked her whether she wanted to be. That was the problem. Gaston had been, in fairness, very efficient about the transition. Car arranged, bag suggested with the specific items she'd need, Wild at Heart closed temporarily, pending a security assessment. All of it presented to her, not quite as decisions she was involved in, but as conclusions already reached, offered for her information. She'd gone along with it, because the arrangement on her doorstep had genuinely frightened her, and fear had a way of making other people's certainty temporarily appealing. By 2:30, the fear had settled into something she could manage. By 4, she'd asked about reopening the shop. Gaston had said, not yet. By 6, she'd asked again, more specifically, about a timeline. When it's safe, he'd said, which was not a timeline. By 8, she'd asked whether anyone had considered asking her what she thought, and the quality of the silence that followed told her that this had not, in fact, been part of the consultation process. Gaston entered the kitchen at 9:15. He was in shirt sleeves, late in his day, working, the jacket abandoned somewhere, and he looked at her across the kitchen island with the expression of someone who was aware a conversation was coming and had been preparing for it. "I need to go back to my shop," Lula said. "Not tonight. Not tonight is reasonable. Tomorrow." "Lula." "Gaston." She kept her voice even. "I have a standing delivery order due Thursday morning. I have a wedding consultation Friday afternoon. I have inventory in coolers with a 4-day shelf life that I purchased with money I need to recover, and I have a business that does not operate without me, because I am the business. I'll have someone handle the deliveries." She stared at him. "You'll have someone handle my deliveries," she said. "A florist. Someone qualified. I am the qualified florist." She came around the island. "Gaston, listen to what you're doing." He was quiet. "You've closed my shop without asking me. You've moved me here without asking me. You've arranged solutions to my problems without asking me what I need." She stopped in front of him. "I understand why. I do. That arrangement this morning was designed to frighten me, and it worked. But what you're doing right now isn't protection. It's just a nicer version of the same thing." Something shifted in his face. "That's not." He stopped. "Someone used my shop as a weapon against you," she said. "I know that. I am scared, and I am angry about being scared, and I need to keep my business alive, and I need you to stop making decisions about my life, and start talking to me about it instead." The kitchen was very quiet. Gaston looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the counter, jaw set, and she could see him working through it, the instinct pulling hard in one direction, something newer and less certain pulling against it. "There are men watching the shop," he said. "If I let you go back, they're visible. Your customers will notice. Then we figure out something less visible. You're not trained for—" "I'm not asking to be trained for anything. I'm asking to sell flowers." She held his gaze. "With reasonable precautions. That we agree on together." He said nothing for a moment. Then, 2 men. Plain clothes. They stay outside, but they're there. Agreed. You call me when you arrive and when you leave. Agreed. If anything feels wrong, you leave immediately. Agreed. His eyes searched her face. "I'm not trying to—" He stopped again, which was unusual enough that she waited. "I'm aware that I do this." "I know," she said. "It doesn't make it better." "No," she agreed. "But knowing it is where better starts." Something in his face shifted. Not relief. Something more complicated and quieter than relief. His hand came up to her face, thumb at her cheekbone, brief and careful. "Thursday morning," he said. "I'll drive you." "You don't have to." "I want to," he said. Lula looked at him. "Okay," she said. His hand dropped. He turned back toward the hallway, paused at the doorway. "The guest room has better light in the morning," he said. "If that matters." "It matters," she said. He nodded once and left. Lula stood alone in the kitchen for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and opened her order log, looking for the thing that had been nagging at the back of her mind since the Bay Ridge breach. A detail in the third order she hadn't fully examined, because the pattern itself had been alarming enough. The payment transfer for the Sunset Park order. She'd noted at the time that it had no account name, but it had a reference number, and the reference number had a prefix she'd seen somewhere before, not on the order itself, but on a different document. A legitimate Luciano account used for the standing weekly arrangement Gastone had set up in his own name. Same prefix, different suffix. Lula sat very still. Then she opened a new page in her notebook and started writing. Gastone found her in the shop's cold storage room at 7 the next morning, sitting on an overturned crate among the buckets of hydrangea, the reference number written across 3 pages of her notebook in increasingly frustrated handwriting. "You didn't sleep," he said. Neither did you. He hadn't. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the careful stillness of a man who'd spent the night deciding how to say something difficult. "I was afraid," he said, without preamble. "When the arrangement showed up on your doorstep, I was afraid, and I turned that fear into orders instead of conversation. Guards, decisions, a house I moved you into without asking whether you wanted to go." He stopped in front of her. "You deserved better than that." Lula set down her pen. "I know why you did it," she said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But it matters that you know the difference now." Something eased in his face, small and real. "I found something," she said, turning the notebook toward him. "The reference prefix on the Sunset Park payment matches your standing order account. Same prefix, different suffix. Whoever's doing this has access to your legitimate account structure. Not just outside knowledge, inside, access." Gastone studied the page for a long moment. "Adrian," he said quietly, "you don't know that. I know he's one of 4 people with that level of financial visibility." His jaw tightened. "And I know he questioned, twice, why I kept returning to a flower shop that didn't need my patronage." Lula felt something cold settle in her chest. "If it's him," she said, "we can't simply confront him. He'll disappear, or worse, warn whoever he's working with." "No," Gastone agreed. "We set a trap." The plan was Lula's, built from the one thing she understood better than anyone in that building: flowers, and what an unusual order looked like from the inside. "We place a false order," she said, spreading fresh sketches across the workbench, while Nico and Gastone listened. 7 white roses. The dahlia, the exact phrasing. I deliver it myself, to an address you choose. Somewhere contained, somewhere you control. Whoever's watching the pattern will assume it's real. "You're not delivering it," Gastone said immediately. "I am." She held his gaze. "It has to look ordinary. A driver, a van with a stranger's face. Anything unusual gets noticed. I deliver flowers every day. Nobody watches me twice." He didn't like it. She watched him not like it. Watched the old instinct rise and get set down deliberately, the way she'd asked him to. "2 men," he said finally, "watching the building. Not visible. You call the moment it's done." Agreed. The warehouse was in Red Hook, chosen because Gastone controlled every inch of it, and Lula walked through its side door at 4 in the afternoon, carrying an arrangement she'd built with her own hands. 7 roses, 1 dahlia, dark as a bruise. Adrian Moretti was waiting. He looked for one unguarded second exactly as surprised as she'd hoped. "Special delivery," Lula said, setting it down with the same brisk cheer she used for every order, watching his eyes catch on the flowers and understand, too late, what he was looking at. The door behind him opened. Gaston stepped through first, Nico behind him, and whatever calculation Adrian attempted in that moment collapsed the instant he saw both men's faces. "Gaston, don't." The word carried no heat, which made it worse. "I trusted you inside my family for 12 years. You used a florist who never asked for any of this to sell out everyone I love." Adrian's hand moved toward his jacket. Nico was faster. It ended quickly, cleanly, without the drama Lula had braced for. Adrian disarmed, restrained, his careful mask finally, completely gone. Gaston crossed the room afterward, past the men securing him, straight to Lula, his hands finding her face before he'd said a single word. "You're all right," he said, not quite a question. "I'm all right." His forehead rested briefly against hers, and Lula felt, beneath the residual adrenaline, something steadier settling into place. Not relief exactly, but the particular quiet of two people who had built a plan together and watched it hold. "Thank you," he said, "for trusting me with this." "Thank you for asking," Lula said, instead of deciding. His mouth curved, small and real. "I'm learning," he said. Spring arrived at Wild at Heart the way it always did. Chaotically, gloriously, with peonies arriving 3 weeks ahead of schedule and Lula elbow-deep in ranunculus by 7 each morning. The shop was hers, still hers. Gaston had offered, once, gently, to expand it, a second location, better equipment, whatever she needed, and Lula had told him, with the particular firmness he'd learned meant the conversation was finished, that Wild at Heart grew at its own pace, or not at all. He'd accepted that. He still visited most mornings, usually with terrible coffee from the shop 2 doors down, usually finding some reason to sit on the workbench stool and watch her work while pretending he had somewhere else to be. Today, he arrived carrying flowers of his own. Lula looked up from the counter, surprised, as he set the arrangement down. An elegant, deliberate collection she recognized immediately as too specific to be accidental. Gardenias, red tulips, ivy, trailing at the edges, a scattering of forget-me-nots. She looked up at him slowly. "Secret love," she said, touching the gardenia. "Declaration of love." Her fingers moved to the tulips, then the ivy. Fidelity. She paused at the forget-me-nots, throat tightening. "Remembrance. For your grandmother," Gaston said quietly. "I thought she should be included." Lula's eyes stung. "You've been paying attention," she said. "Always." She looked at the arrangement again. Every flower chosen, every meaning intentional, a language he'd learned entirely for her, and felt something in her chest that had nothing left in common with the woman who'd once stepped back from his kiss and called herself too much. "There's one more thing," Gaston said. She looked up. He wasn't kneeling. He wasn't performing anything. That wasn't who he was, and she loved him too much to want him pretending otherwise. He simply reached into his jacket and produced a small velvet box, setting it on the counter between them with the same steady, deliberate care he brought to everything that mattered. "Not today. If you're not ready," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I only wanted you to know it exists, whenever you want it." Lula looked at the box, then at him. "You're terrible at romantic timing," she said. "There's a customer due in 10 minutes. I'm aware. And you brought this up in front of my dahlias." They seemed like appropriate witnesses. She laughed, unguarded, real, the same laugh that had escaped her the day he'd explained ranunculus with total seriousness, and rounded the counter to stand in front of him. "Ask me properly," she said, not a statement. Something warm moved behind his eyes. "Marry me," he said, then catching himself, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Would you marry me, Lula?" Still not quite a question. "Would you marry me?" he said. "Please." Lula reached up and kissed him, slow and certain, his hand finding her waist the way it always did. Steady, deliberate, nothing wasted. "Yes," she said, against his mouth. The bell above the door chimed. A customer stepped inside, glanced at the two of them, and tactfully pretended to study the seasonal display. Gaston didn't step back. Neither did Lula. Outside, the spring light fell warm across Wild at Heart's window, across her grandmother's chalkboard handwriting, across a man who had once bought a funeral arrangement out of pure stubbornness and never quite managed to leave. He was still there. He always would be. If Lula and Gaston's love story just made your whole week, hit subscribe. Comment your favorite flower and where you're watching from. Type. Try me if that kiss lived rent-free.